Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and this is our weekly monk chat session, opportunity to ask any questions related to Buddhism, and I'll do my best to answer. So whenever you have some questions, you can go ahead and type them into the comments window, and I'll answer them in the order that they appear. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll start going through any questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello to the people who have checked in online so far. Hello to Jerry, Alyssa, Lydia, Jarrett, Hasanta, Kumu, Manal, and all the other people who are watching. Also Bhumika and Olga. And we have a question here from Jerry. Jerry says, how can I bring a sense of play and joy back to my meditation? It has gotten very dry and uncomfortable, and I think that's what I've lost. Well, one thing which helps a lot is to experiment with different ways of meditating. Experiment with either new meditation methods or with different ways of practicing with whatever meditation object or technique you're currently using. And for bringing a sense of joy, again, it really helps if you enjoy the method that you're using, but also search for some aspect of it which is pleasant. So focusing on the pleasant aspect of your meditation object. That also helps tremendously. And do a lot of metta meditation. Loving kindness meditation also tends to bring a sense of joy to one's meditation. So Jarrett asks, if the Buddha taught that each of us has no soul or self, what part of us transmigrates through each lifetime? Well, I tend to think of it in terms of causality. So the choices and decisions that we make are the causes and conditions, which then create corresponding results in future lifetimes. So it's not that a part of us transmigrates per se, but rather that the decisions that we make create the causal basis for future arising, for future occurrences. So if we wanted to speak in a certain way, then we could say that it's our karma. So karma means action or choice. So our karma, every action or choice that we make, then creates a corresponding future result. And that's what creates the appearance of an ongoing being passing from life to life. Okay, and I see a lot more people checking in. So hello also to Samir, Margaret, Karuna, Leilani, Maria, Elaine, and Yankee. Hello to all of you. And there's another question here from Hasanta. Hasanta says, could you conceptualize Nirvana as an eternal present with no suffering? It's always dangerous when we start conceptualizing Nirvana because it is something which is outside the domain of concepts. It's not something which can be touched by concepts or ideas. So can it be called eternal? There is a way you can say that, but it's a little dangerous. Rather more useful is to say that Nirvana is not subject to time. So it doesn't have a beginning or an end, and it doesn't change. So then time is not relevant to Nirvana. I wouldn't say eternal because eternal is already including the idea of time. The sense of something which lasts forever, has always lasted and will always last and last forever. So it's a sense of something which passes through time. Whereas Nirvana just doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with time. So it's timeless is probably what I would say instead of eternal. Similarly, present is a bit of an awkward word to use in relation to Nirvana because, again, present is normally set as being not past and not future. So that which is in between past and future. But in Nirvana, as I mentioned, there's no past and no future. So it's just not relevant. There's no beginning and no end. But no suffering, yeah, absolutely, there is no suffering. This is the big appeal of Nirvana. There's no suffering. And Samir says, I noticed that without necessarily wanting to, without necessarily meaning to, we practice avoidance. We sit down to avoid the world. We sit in silent meditation to get away from things. Well, it depends on what you mean by avoidance. So avoiding the world, for example, well, I mean, good luck. Sitting down doesn't make the world go away. It's still there. And as long as you're basically, you can never completely avoid the world. So even an awakened being still experiences the world. They're just experiencing it without suffering and delusion. So trying to avoid the world is utterly futile. It's literally impossible. There's no way to avoid the world. Sitting down definitely isn't going to do it. Similarly, you sit in silent meditation to get away from things. Well, it depends on what you're trying to get away from. If you're trying to get away from your own greed, hatred, and delusion, well, then that's good. That's a good reason to sit in meditation. Yeah. But if you're sitting in meditation to get away from things, well, again, it depends what you mean by get away from things. So what we're doing in meditation practice is actually coming face to face with our own mind, clearly observing what's actually going on in our own mind. So intimate familiarity with the inside of our own mind. So it's actually impossible to escape our own mind. Through meditation practice, we're actually becoming intimately familiar with it. Okay, and next, so Anonymous says, do you remember the sutta where the Buddha said he would poison himself? No, there's no such sutta. Then the Devas said they would go into his stomach and take the poison out, and he said he would starve, and the Devas said they would feed him through his pores, etc. So what you're referring to is actually, and you have the details a little bit wrong, but I suspect you're referring to one of the stories the Buddha gave from before he attained awakening. So while he was still not yet fully awakened, he was practicing according to the ascetic spiritual practices, which were taught at the time. And one of them was the extreme fasting. So avoiding food to the point where you almost die. And so at one point, the Buddha was doing this extreme fasting, and he was getting to the point where he was close to death, and he decided he was just going to just not eat anymore. Like he was done with food. He would just try not eating at all, which means that he would starve to death, basically. And at that point, then a Deva said to the Buddha, like they said, we don't want to let you die. So if you stop eating food altogether, then the Devas would use their psychic powers to basically put food directly in the Buddha's stomach. So to feed the Buddha directly. In order to keep the Buddha's body alive so that he could continue developing the path. And this was because these were Devas who had been watching the Buddha's practice for a long time and were interested in seeing the Buddha succeed and become fully awakened. So they weren't willing to let the Buddha die through this kind of extreme asceticism. But I don't remember the Buddha threatening to poison himself. I think he was threatening to starve himself to death. And it was because that was, at the time, that was taught as a path to enlightenment by one of the non-Buddhist traditions at the time. And the Buddha later said that those practices of extreme fasting are not useful. They don't lead to awakening. They don't lead to wisdom. And Samir says, by get away from things, I mean, I find myself keeping some experiences at arm's length sometimes, not completely experiencing duality. How can we ensure a practice of unconditional equanimity? Again, I don't really understand what you're talking about. So keeping experiences at arm's length. Well, one thing is that we do want to maintain constant, clear awareness. So mindfulness of our experience. But we also want to be clearly aware of whether or not we're fueling our defilements. So we want to be aware of the choices and decisions that we're making in each moment, as to whether those choices and decisions are strengthening our desires, aversions, and delusions, or weakening them. Because again, we might think that we're not really doing anything, but you look closely at your own mind and you realize that you are in fact engaging in mental activities of desire, aversion, and delusion. So we want to really closely watch that and make sure we're not doing that. I have no idea what you mean by not completely experiencing duality. So you'll have to explain what you mean by that. And so you ask, how can we assure a practice of unconditional equanimity? Yeah, so it starts with mindfulness, constant, clear awareness. You have to be clearly aware of your experience in order to practice equanimity. So equanimity, the Pali word is upekkha, and the word upekkha literally means looking closely. So if you're not looking closely at your experience, then you're not practicing upekkha. You're not practicing equanimity. So it's looking closely at our experience, but not reacting. So this is quite the opposite of ignoring things or avoiding things. It's actually paying close attention, but without reacting either with desire or aversion. And Kristen says, is it reasonable to ask devas for help with worldly needs, like support looking for a job? I always feel shy to ask for anything in this regard, but I'm not sure if that is ironically egotistical. I mean, you can ask devas for things if you want to. I mean, this isn't really in the domain of Buddhism. Buddhism is about attaining awakening. So the Buddha did say that there are devas, and that it is possible to ask them for help, and that devas do sometimes involve themselves in human activities. So, and it doesn't hurt if you want to ask devas for help with looking for a job. It doesn't hurt to ask. It's not anti-Buddhist, but it's also, I mean, it's fine. If you want to do that, it's fine. It's neither pro nor anti-Buddhism. Anonymous says, do you remember the name of that sutta? Not off the top of my head, but I could probably dig it up if I looked online. Might be the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the Noble Quest, Discourse on the Noble Quest. I think so, but I don't remember for sure. That's the last question online, so not many questions so far this evening. Any questions from the residents here? Yeah.
So something I had in mind was, how do you practice humbleness? I noticed that this is a quality that you have, and I was just wondering, like, what are your insights on that?
One thing that's helpful is to remember that whatever good traits you see in yourself, there are other people who are better at it. This is advice was given to me by Ajahn Brahmali many years ago. So I actually asked him about exactly this, like, how can I cultivate humility? How can I stop arrogance? And this was his advice. So he's like, you think you're a good scholar? Well, there's monks who are better scholars than you. So I'm like, oh, I'm nowhere near as good a scholar as Bhante Analayo, for example. It's like, oh, you think you're good at Pali? There's other monks who are much better. You think you're good at meditation? There's others who are much better. You think you're good at equanimity? There's others who are much better. So it's always remembering, it's like, oh, there's others who are better than me. Like everything. So it's not that I don't have some skills well developed, because I do. But it's that there are other people in the world who have it much better developed. So it doesn't make sense for me to be arrogant about something when I'm really not the best in the world. And even if by some miracle you actually do happen to be the best in the world about something, well, you're still not as good as the Buddha. So this is something that can be useful. But these sorts of practices are more relevant for people who have a problem with arrogance. So for people who have low self-esteem, it's usually actually the opposite is good. Focus on your good qualities. Relish your good qualities. Because then that helps to prevent the opposite problem, which is having an inferiority complex. Okay, there's a couple more questions online. Rick says, what are skillful ways to care and comfort people or pets in the final days and hours of their lives? Be present with them. Be kind to them. See what you can do to make their days more comfortable. But the most important thing is to be there for them. It's not necessarily about what you do, but rather it's about being present so that they feel like there's somebody there who cares about them and is available if they need something. And listening to them. Yeah, offering them kindness. Be in their presence with a mind of loving kindness. I think that's the most important thing. So Lydia asked, could you repeat the in-house questions? Yeah, so Thinnery had asked how to practice humility. So if there's more in-house questions, I'll repeat them. Okay, and Samir further clarifies, saying, by not completely experiencing, I mean the sense of subject-object separation, i.e. self and world. But deep in my practice, this distinction dissipates. Is this good? How can I develop this further? If you're practicing certain forms of insight meditation, such as the recognition of impermanence or objectless samadhi, then yes, there does come a point where the sense of separation between self and world dissipates. Yeah, that's normal. In fact, that's how it should be going. And you develop it further by letting go of attachment to things. So that's actually a good thing, but that's something which normally happens with relatively advanced meditation. Often when people think subject-object separation is fading, or they think the separation between self and world is fading, what's actually happening is their mindfulness is fading. So often people think, oh, I'm letting go of all things and clearly perceiving non-dual reality. But it's, well, actually, you're letting go of your mindfulness and clearly spacing out into blurriness, like blurry-mindedness. So make sure that your mind is extremely sharp, alert, awake, and clearly aware. So this is very important. When practicing Buddhist meditation correctly, the mind is always aware, sharply, precisely, clearly aware. Even if what it's clearly aware of is that all objects have vanished, which again can happen in certain meditation techniques. Okay, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. What's the best meditation technique to keep your mind sharp, awake, and memorize?
So best technique to keep the mind sharp and awake?
And keep a good memory of things.
Well, I don't really care too much about good memory of things. The important thing is, yeah, awake and alert. With meditation, there's a few things which help tremendously. One is to meditate with your eyes open. That makes a huge difference. Another thing which helps is to use a meditation method that's interesting for you. So if the meditation method you're using is not interesting, then your mind will constantly try to escape by either through fantasizing and thinking or through going blurry and dull, numbing out. So eyes open, meditation technique that's interesting. cultivate joy in your meditation. So really, for example, if you're doing mindfulness of the body, enjoy the experience of your body. That also helps to keep the mind present and interested. Also, loving kindness meditation also tends to be good. Again, because it tends to be naturally a very pleasant and peaceful experience. So the mind naturally wants to be there for it, wants to be aware of it.
And is there a best time of the day?
Every time of day. Yeah, every time of day is the best time. So it's different for different people. So some people notice they meditate better at certain times of day, but realistically, just any moment when you have free time, that's a good time to do some meditation. Do you have a question?
Yes, Bante. When one is going to try a new approach to their meditation practice, do you recommend that they practice that method exclusively for several weeks at a time to really see the results? One of the mistakes I think I've done is just hopping around different techniques and not sticking with one particular approach regularly.
So you're asking about when trying something new, if you should focus on just that method for a while.
Yes.
And not necessarily. So what I actually usually recommend is if you have a method which you already are relatively proficient in and which you like to do and which gets decent results for you, then it's okay to actually do that 80% of the time, give or take a bit. And then do your experimenting with the other 20% or so of your time. Because you want to keep doing something that's working, because that will, one thing, it will maintain your confidence in your practice, but it would also make sure that you actually continue to make progress in your meditation. And you also want to do some experimentation and such, because it does, it keeps your practice alive and growing. It gives the space for your practice to improve. And for you to develop new ways of practicing which are useful for you. So if you are trying something new and you're really loving it and it seems like it's going great, then yeah, you might do it all the time. But if you have something else which is already going well for you, then I think it makes sense to still do that much of the time.
Oh, and if you're still like on a rudimentary level and you're just trying to get established, and then what would you say?
And really anything is fine. Like when one is in the early stages of one's meditation practice, it almost doesn't really matter what exact method you're using. What matters is that you're trying.
And being consistent.
It just matters that you're trying.
Okay.
So in the very beginning, we really don't have any clue what's going on with our mind. And so it's just doing anything that starts to cultivate some degree of mindfulness, concentration, and equanimity. And then after we've started to develop at least a basic minimum of mindfulness, concentration, and equanimity, then we can get a bit more specific and refined. But in the early stages, like, there's no point in trying to get refined. Like, just anything that starts to cultivate these basic meditation qualities. And Mary says, without them, any advice how to stop this? I think there's a part missing to your question, Mary. So maybe if you could, I think there's a missing piece of information here. So if you can provide that, I'll try to answer. And Dave says, when you encouraged a person who cannot mentally visualize things, would you say there are similar Dhamma doors opened by loss of other senses? How can we take advantage of sense loss? Well, first off, I wouldn't associate difficulty visualizing with loss of senses. That seems like a bit of a jump. So your question, how to take advantage of sense loss? Well, I actually don't have an experience of sense loss. But if it does happen to you, well, you can be grateful that you have fewer things to distract you. Like if you lose your hearing, well, great, now you won't be distracted by hearing while you meditate. Lose your sense of smell, perfect. Now you don't smell the body odor of the people next to you. Or the overpowering perfume that people wear. Actually, this is what really blows my mind. Like living in monasteries all the time where, generally speaking, people don't wear fragrances. And somebody walks in the room with some really strong smelling deodorant or perfume or cologne or something, and it's just overwhelming. I would actually rather smell unwashed bodies than people's perfume. So yeah, if you lose your sense of smell, great, delightful. Yeah, I mean, if you lose your senses, then you practice with what that's like. So equanimity around not having those sensations. Okay. And Mary says, look above. I'm not seeing it. I don't understand. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mary. I don't understand what you're referring to. If you could please specify, I'll do my best. Do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. So, I have been praying in the Pali uh, prayers, the original prayers. But recently, I started praying uh, just the meaning of some sutras, and when I read the meaning only without the Pali, it gives me aware of what I'm saying, and it also um, I also put my into my mind that this is things uh, I got from those sutras and things I should do or not do. Is it fine if I just keep praying only from the meaning in English or Sinhalese, which I understand, and not to say in the Pali?
So he's asking if it's okay to chant in his own language that he understands instead of in Pali. And briefly speaking, yeah, it's fine. Um, one of the reasons for chanting is to remind ourselves of the Dhamma. And if you don't know Pali, then doing it in a language you do know is naturally going to be better at reminding you of the meaning. It's still useful to do chanting in Pali because it gives a sense of connection to the ancient tradition. And also because if you do eventually learn Pali, then you will understand that the meaning of the Pali phrases is often much more profound than what you see in the translations. So that alone is a good enough reason. But yeah, it's the sense of connection. So these are teachings which have been recited in this format, in this language for more than 2,000 years, maybe very close to quotations of the Buddha himself, which is just mind-blowing that we can recite the words of the Buddha. So I wouldn't completely eliminate Pali chanting from your life, but it is fine to do chanting in your own language, if even most of the time, if that's what you prefer to do. That's fine. And Samir says, embodiment is a term I've often heard about. Is there a relationship between embodiment and enlightenment? Is enlightenment the fully embodied non-conceptual experience? I have no idea what people mean when they say embodiment. You would have to define the word. It's not a word which I've seen anywhere in the suttas. I don't even know how you would say embodiment in Pali. So you'd have to define what you mean by it, because I really don't know. If by embodiment you mean mindfulness of the body, then I would say yes, that's a good thing. But if you mean something else, you'll have to explain what you mean. Do you have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
When you say keep the mind clear, focus, who is telling to keep the mind focused when thoughts are appearing?
That's not a useful question. Just stay aware.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't need to ask who, just be aware.
So when there are thoughts appearing, so just let it appear.
Just be aware. Just don't be involved in the thoughts. Let them
Okay.
flow through the mind.
Okay.
As long as you don't participate in them, then they don't have any power over you. Most of the thoughts that appear in the mind are like background noise. It's like overhearing somebody else's conversation. So you just let it flow through the mind. Don't pay any attention. Don't react. Don't participate. Then there's no problem. You actually don't need to force the mind to be silent. You just need to stop taking your thoughts seriously. Then they'll just immediately not be a problem. Okay? Yeah. Rick says, can you share ways to cultivate patience? What are practices that create the conditions for patience to arise? Cultivate patience. Whenever you see the urge or impulse to change something, wait. Wait for a few seconds at least. Actually, meditation practice is a great way to cultivate this. You feel the urge to move your posture. Well, wait. Just wait a few seconds. There's a little bit of patience. Somebody's talking and they keep droning on and they're saying things in a really long, drawn out way, and they keep like pausing randomly. Well, just wait. Practice loving kindness. Actually, loving kindness also really helps with cultivating patience. Let's see. And Dharma with Nick says, what can someone do who is denied permission to ordain as a Buddhist monk by his or her parents, especially when you come from non-Buddhist countries and parents belong to different religious beliefs? Yeah, just ignore what they say and go off and become a monk. Yeah, that seems like the obvious solution. That's what I did. So Ogolde says, what was the question? I think they're referring to your question. What was your question? Something about thinking, not getting involved in thoughts or something.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, next, Dan says, uninvolved as a translation of samatha. Wow, that is just completely wrong. No, samatha literally means peacefulness. So it's from the root sam, which means peace, and the suffix ta, which means ness. So samatha literally means peacefulness. Yeah, uninvolved is totally wrong. Like, I don't know who came up with that. That's just not even remotely close to correct. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions from online or from the residents here, so maybe that's enough for this evening. So we'll go ahead and, no, we just got another question here. So Samir says, is there a way to integrate loving kindness practice with other non-metta techniques? How can one do a technique with simultaneous love and compassion? Well, to take the second question, simultaneous love and compassion, so metta and karuna, that's actually very direct because the two are so close to each other. Actually, often when people are doing metta practice, they're actually doing metta karuna practice. So people think, oh, I'm doing metta meditation, but actually they're naturally incorporating karuna as well. So those come together very easily. The actual distinction between metta and karuna is subtle enough and refined enough that it's actually not really relevant most of the time. As for combining metta with other non-metta techniques, it goes very well with mindfulness of the body, as most things do. Goes well with mindfulness of emotion, and goes great with equanimity, with patience. But generally speaking, when doing a meditation method, you want to do just that method. Mixing in multiple methods at the same time tends to just make the mind a bit confused. So it's usually not recommended. Just do one thing at a time. That's better. Okay, and that looks like it for the evening. So we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and we'll see you all next time.